Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your sociology instructor. In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about the research process. In the early days of sociology, sociologists were more concerned with developing theories about how society operates than they were testing those theories. In the early 1920s, at the University of Chicago, so here's a Google Earth map. This would be Lake Michigan. Here's the huge metropolitan city of Chicago. And right in downtown Chicago on the lake is the University of Chicago. This school had a very famous sociology department where some early sociologists were concerned about testing the theories that were developed. You can read about in your textbook these two sociologists and how they emphasized different aspects of gathering data, but both were concerned about doing research to test theories. So the University of Chicago, sometimes called the Chicago School of Sociology, was very influential in using a scientific research method to test hypotheses. When I thought about making a video for this topic, I thought about my master's thesis. At the end of getting a master's degree in a subject that is a science, in my case a social science, usually the student has to write a thesis. And a thesis is a research project using the scientific method to find a problem, formulate hypotheses, gather data, analyze the data, and report your findings. And so before I made this lecture, I went back and I revisited my master's thesis and saw exactly how it mirrored what's in your textbook on conducting research in sociology. This master's thesis was for my master's in psychology, and I was actually already teaching college students at the time with my master's in counseling. And as a teacher, I was very confounded by students who thought they would do well in class but weren't doing well at all. So in general, there were three types of students. Students who studied hard, who had a history of good grades, and who did well on my tests. There were students who didn't do well, had a history of poor grades, and did poorly on my tests. Then there was that third group, the group of students who thought they were going to do well in a class and on tests, and didn't do well at all. And they were not just perplexing to me, but they were very frustrating because I wanted my students to do well. That was the problem that became the basis of my research. So let's look at those steps in conducting research. In a science, first you have to define the problem. And that was the problem I was finding, was that some students were predicting that they would do really well on a test, weren't doing well at all, and were getting frustrated, as was I. So after I discovered that this was the area I wanted to do my research on, I went and reviewed the literature in the area of this topic. And I found that actually a lot of research had been done. So here's my master's thesis. It's in a hardbound book kept at the library. One copy is kept at the library where I got my master's degree. And 28 pages, in other words, a huge section of my master's thesis, is just on reviewing the literature of research that had already been done in this topic. So what had other researchers done? What did they find? Where were there gaps in the research? What still needed to be explored? So it took me a long time to review all the research that had been done in this subject area. Then I went ahead and formulated specific hypotheses. I had 3 hypotheses for my research that I tested, but let's make this a little more simple. And just one of the hypotheses was to, well, here's the hypothesis. Students who base their grade predictions on higher grades would predict their grades more accurately than students who base their grade predictions on criteria other than higher grades. Now you can see that that's a hypothesis. A hypothesis can be tested. We can actually gather data and test the hypothesis using statistical methods. And to go back to a prior video, I was doing quantitative research. The next step I had to do was select a research design. And as we'll be talking about in this chapter, as you'll be reading about in your textbook, you can see that there's many different ways of conducting research. I used a survey to conduct my research. I had students predict their grades on a survey form. I had them base what they made those predictions on, and then I gathered data on how they actually did on tests and compared their predictions to their actual test results and what they based those predictions on. So after I designed this, I had to actually go before a review board, a research review board, and have it okayed for both soundness of the research design and that it complied to all the ethical rules in psychology. So again, I was doing this in psychology, not sociology, but the research methods are the same. Then I had to go ahead and carry out the research. I didn't ask my students. I thought there might be a little bit of conflict of interest there. So I had a colleague at a neighboring community college conduct the research for me. She gathered all the data from her students. She got the permission, and then she passed the data off to me, deleting all the individual names of the students once the grades and their predictions had been paired with each other. The names didn't matter. It was just the raw data that I needed. Then I went and interpreted my results. This is where all those many semesters of taking statistics came in. I conducted many statistical tests on my data. I compared the students to what they based their predictions on and how they actually did. This was a tricky part of the research design because you have to be good in statistics, and I worked very closely with one of my statistics professors in getting the right statistical tests and analyzing the data. After all of that, it was time to write it all up and report the findings. Now, my master's thesis is only 45 pages long. It's a relatively short master's thesis. It's very concise. Many people write master's theses or doctor's dissertations if you're getting a PhD much longer, but mine was fairly short, but it was how it was a documentation of this whole research process, including the development of the theory, the looking at all the literature from what had been done in the area, to conducting the research, to analyzing the data and reporting the findings. In other words, did my hypotheses pan out? And they did. Now, at this point, if you're a student like I was, your research for a master's degree or a doctor's degree is actually part of the literature for that particular school that you're going into. You can go ahead and publish your research and get it into a professional journal. I was tired and didn't take that next step and have it published into any professional journals, but I could have done that. And then that brings the research process back to what in this diagram shows repetition. In other words, now other researchers can take your research design, see what you did, possibly add on to the research, change a few variables, and see if they can expand the knowledge in the subject area, and the research design goes around again. So that's the method of doing research in sociology and other sciences. Again, both the hard sciences and the social sciences use pretty much the same method for doing research.